Welcome, everyone. We're just going to get started in a couple of minutes. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here and for joining us today. Welcome to our conversation titled Connecting the Past to the Future, the Role of Storytelling in Achieving Equity. My name is Nada Hassan, and I'm honored to be the moderator today. I am one of the student representatives on the board at the Global Alliance for Behavioral Health and Social Justice. I'm a PhD candidate and Canada Graduate Vanier Scholar at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University in Toronto, Canada. My work takes an interdisciplinary approach to exploring the intersections of race, place, and health, and my doctoral work does this through engaging racialized communities through photography and stories. So I'm really excited about our conversation today with four incredible people who engage in storytelling, and specifically storytelling as a pathway towards equity. But before we get started, and even though this is virtual, I'd like to situate and ground us through a land acknowledgement. So I am based in what is known as Toronto, Canada, from the Mohawk word Toronto. And this land has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. And I'd like to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And so this place and the places where all of us are joining from today are home to many, many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, or what is known as North America. And personally, as a first-generation immigrant and settler on this land, I am incredibly grateful to be here. And so I invite all of us to continue to learn about the histories of this land and the importance of engaging in meaningful truth and reconciliation. So I'm going to introduce our speakers very briefly, but I want to note that this is a very brief introduction to their work. We're going to be putting their full bios and links to their work in the chat. So I encourage you to read, explore, and learn more. And I'm going to go through quickly in alphabetical order. So Dr. Yewande Addy is a health communications fellow within the Centers for Disease Control's Division of Population Health. She supports Project Refocus, which responds to the public health crises in racialized communities. And she also led the Black Student Storytelling Project at the University of Florida. Dr. Alicia Ali is an associate professor in the Department of Applied Psychology at New York University, where she heads the Advocacy and Community-Based Trauma Studies Lab. So she will share and explore the role of storytelling in her work with military veterans, domestic violence survivors, and refugee groups. Dr. Brenda Manilido is a cultural anthropologist and a leading Indigenous digital storyteller, consultant, and trainer. She's the co-founder of IndigDreams, an Indigenous approach to digital storytelling for healing and truth-telling. And last but not least, Dr. Matthew Miller is a professor at Loyola University and directs the Race, Culture, and Health Equity Lab there. And his evolving storytelling work is the Spoken Project, a series of first-person documentary-style videos designed to help people cope with racism and to provide experiences of validation, support, and healing. So a very warm welcome to all of our speakers today. And before I get started, just a quick reminder to put your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll try to leave some time at the end for our panelists to respond. And so to start us off, I'm going to invite each of our speakers to please describe your experiences with storytelling as a tool for connecting the past with the future. And specifically, we want to hear about the populations and the communities that you are working with. And so just to get us started, Dr. Manilido, maybe I'll invite you to start, and then we'll move on to Dr. Addy, Dr. Ali, and Dr. Miller before we open it up and have a broader conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining this panel. And I am so excited about this conversation. I wish it could go on for days. That's what we need to do this important work and to hear each other's important work. So thank you also, Nana, for the land acknowledgement. I'm Danae, and I'm transmitting across this beautiful technology from the beautiful sacred homeland of the Lakota Ray in northern Wisconsin, and I'm just so happy to be here. The question is about how we use the past to connect the future. And I think one of the things that is so important is that when we talk about stories, when we talk about where we come from and where we're going and what we're doing, it's all coming from this place of our bodies, our sacred breaths, this homeland that we share. And it's through these bodies and through this breath and through these voices that we're going to be able to come to an understanding of how we're all related. Many of us who have worked with Native peoples have heard about our 7 generations, that everything that we think, that we do, that we say can impact the generations behind us and the generations in front of us. So that's why this work is so important. Let me take a case in point. It's here in the United States, we're beginning to talk about that truth telling about Indian boarding schools. And I know up in Canada, they've had discussions in other nations. And it's time. It's time to really go into the stories. And that's what IndigiDreams has been doing for many years, is beginning to bring some of the most traumatized Indigenous peoples forward, who are so, if we create the right setting and create that agency for them to choose, to talk, to speak, to share, to distribute how they want to share those stories, that we can not only look at the historical traumas of our Native peoples, but the historical greatness. But it takes us further. How is it that we survived? What was the mindset of the people who created these boarding schools? And why did they take the boarding schools during the Japanese internment camps of the 40s and use them? And why are we still doing that on the US border today? So it gets us to get really critical to think about what are those historical fears that led to those historical traumas. And I think that's where these stories urge us on as human beings that are connected through our DNA to storytelling and through connection. And so I think that's why all of our work is so important. And I'm really glad to begin that conversation here with each of you and with all our audience. Thank you.
That's a tough intro to follow, Dr. Brenda. Thank you all so much again for being here. I'm joining you from the motherland, but my fatherland, Nigeria. So please forgive any ambient noise that you might hear in the background. We're a rambunctious people. I've had the pleasure of using storytelling as a modality for healing historical and present day racial traumas, both through the arts and in the research space. Much of this work has actually been done at a predominantly white university, surprise, with a wonderful Center for Arts and Medicine and an equally wonderful Center for African Studies. I've collaborated on several different projects, including the Black Student Storytelling Project, which is a digital archive of student stories that center Black PWI experiences across the diaspora. Another project that I'd like to mention is titled From Color to Black, and it's actually a theatrical intervention on race-based health inequities in North Florida. And in that particular work, true accounts were essentially culled from our oral archives and creatively reformatted for the stage. In both of those projects, specifically, we used the past to orient and to preserve Black experiences. And then through the research, we then interrogate, opportunities and limitations of using storytelling to really change people's understanding of those existing links and the lineage of anti-Black racism, which runs quite deep globally. And luckily, with the recent designation of racism as a threat to public health, we now have more leverage and space and resources to investigate and to intervene. And I'm really grateful to be building on that charge as a CDC fellow with Project Refocus, working with some really brilliant people, Dr. Jasmine Goodman, Dr. Monica Ponder from Howard University, Dr. Chandra Ford from UCLA, Dr. Rashid Njai out of our Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. And, we're still in the piloting phase, but every day I'm really looking forward to sharing more of the valuable community informed stories that I know are going to soon come out of our pilot sites. So thank you so much.
Thank you, both of you. It's very exciting to be with you all. I'm Alicia Alley. I'm at New York University, so I'm in New York City, in Greenwich Village right now, Indigenous home to the Lenape. There's so much that we do in our work with veterans that is really about capturing the stories from the past and learning about ourselves in the present through those stories. What we do in the Decroot program is we use Shakespeare to treat trauma in veterans. And we treat it, not we come together and talk. We use the model of Yvonne Nolan, who is based in Saskatchewan in Canada, her group called Native Voices. She's Algonquin, and she developed a model called Theater as Medicine. And the basis of our program merges Shakespeare's text with her work on the healing power of theater and story sharing. And, what we do with the veterans is we immerse them in Shakespeare's world, in his texts. They see that there are soldiers, veterans, family members of veterans in every single one of Shakespeare's plays, the comedies and the tragedies. And what we find is that they learn through that there's a timelessness to veteran suffering, that veterans from centuries ago during Shakespeare's time suffered in very much the same way that they do now, by virtue of the language that Shakespeare used to capture so accurately and eloquently what that suffering feels like. And so they connect to the past and to centuries of veterans through that text. The other way that we use storytelling to connect to the past is acknowledging that we live in a historical moment now that has been transformed so much through all the technological advances in the military world. That means that there's an immediacy, and they could be at home, in Utah, and hours later they could be in Fallujah, and then they could be in Germany. They could be serving in combat and back home with their families just hours later. And it's very different than the experience historically for American soldiers and veterans, where, for instance, World War I, World War II, their experience of coming home, of transitioning back to civilian life, involved them being for days and days together with their comrades, fellow soldiers, on ships together, where they would decompress and they would use that time to tell their stories to each other. They would tell what they'd seen, what they'd learned, what they'd felt, with people who understand them. And by the time they came back, they had started to do some of that healing, and they did it through this story sharing, which is really what our model is based on. And so we have them study the Shakespearean monologue form. At that point, they construct their own first-person trauma monologue that they will then share with a fellow veteran in the group, and the fellow veteran will memorize, rehearse, and ultimately recite that for the group. And so the aesthetic distance that comes into play by a veteran hearing a fellow veteran recite their trauma, maybe they had a trauma they wrote about where innocent civilians died, they blame themselves, a comrade died, they blame themselves. But that aesthetic distance allows them to empathize with their fellow veteran, to begin to forgive themselves. And that beginning of healing and sharing is really the power of the storytelling. And so much of it is based on what we've learned from the past, and we always acknowledge our indebtedness, and not only our indebtedness to the history of what Shakespeare has done in terms of shaping our cultural understanding of trauma and suffering for generations, but also the indigenous roots of welcoming the warrior back into the tribe by saying, act out and tell us your story. Our final session in our program is a culminating performance where the veterans invite family members and friends, and they tell their story by sharing their own first-person trauma monologue. And then that's followed by reciting a monologue from Shakespeare that we use an algorithm that has paired the nature of their trauma with a monologue from Shakespeare that reflects that same trauma, that allows them to sort of re-regulate. They breathe through the iambic pentameter of Shakespeare, is known to re-regulate the human heartbeat, to beat or not to beat, that is the question. They ground, they breathe, they use classical actor training, they connect to the audience, they then pass it on to their fellow veteran who will recite their story next. So it completes that circle of healing. So you can see all these elements that have their roots in indigenous models of healing. So our program would not exist without that.
I am inspired by my colleagues' work, and I told my friends earlier that one of us does not belong on this panel, and that one of us is me. But I am really happy to be here. My name is Matt Miller, and I'm a professor at Loyola University Chicago. I'm in the suburbs of the Chicago, and I believe perhaps the closest lands would be the lands of the Peoria. So I describe myself as a researcher who's trying to reimagine what it is to be a researcher. I'm trained in the field of psychology, and I believe there's knowledge that is helpful to people. But I think over the last several years of my personal and professional life, I've been trying to think about how am I making an impact in the world and the communities I want to help. I'm really interested in disrupting systems of racism and helping individuals cope and heal from racism. And I ultimately felt like I don't know that if I publish another paper, if that's really going to do it. I don't know. But so what I did was I picked up a camera a couple years ago and have found the power of storytelling. And I'll just say this, when I've interviewed probably 20, 25 people, and when people are telling their stories, when they assume the role of storyteller, there is a power and a healing that happens. And I think that is in part reflecting is that they're connecting to their ancestors, they're connecting to their parents, their grandparents, people that they don't know, but they are connected to through the shared struggle of oppression but power and resilience. And I felt that in the room. I've been in the room behind the camera listening to a story, and I have been transformed in that moment and found meaning myself. And so I think the storytelling is such a powerful way to connect us to this group of people who I've only met on Zoom a couple times, and feeling a sense of connection and looking back at the work. So I feel like that there is something almost metaphysical that happens that we can tap into. And for quantitative researchers like myself, it really is like quite a transformative experience to realize that, for so many years, maybe I've just been almost there, but now leaning into the storytelling work is a way to really bring to bear meaningful ways of helping people connect and kind of survive and heal from racism experiences in my work in Spoken Project.
Thank you so much to all of you for sharing that and sort of like expanding on some of the work that you've been doing. I mean, what's also striking to me is the different disciplines that everyone here comes from. And I know you're sort of navigating this academia and sort of research, but practice. And I think I'm thinking health communications, anthropology to psychology, but then there are similar threads that I'm already hearing throughout all of your work, and the very compelling aspect of storytelling, story sharing, and the influence it has in connecting and also healing. And so I think that leads us really nicely into my next question, which is, how has storytelling been used in your work specifically as a pathway to achieving equity? And I know we've touched on a lot of this, a lot of the isms like racism and historical traumas, but I'll open it up to anyone who wants to go first.
Well, I don't mind starting us off. You're right. Quite a few isms have come up in this conversation already. And when we think about exploring areas like, for me, anti-Black racism or any form of racism, especially via the arts or research, I find that the nature of the inquiry itself is intended to build equity simply because we know that the work is going to exist at the margins of a much larger, often white canon. But if I can be just specific to the work that I've done, if I look at the Black Student Storytelling Project, for example, that was completely designed to give those at the center of the research, Black students, the opportunity to really amplify marginalized experiences and then recast a more improved version of their world. And so all of those insights were kind of pulled together and then used to develop some prescriptive university policy recommendations to make the environment more palatable and more welcoming for students of all races, creeds, colors, and backgrounds. And the stories themselves have then also been used as equity tools in the classroom, specifically for 2 university courses in race and identity. And so that's just a brief example of the relationship between actually setting out and designing work that's embedded with storytelling elements and then getting to some pathway of achieving equity.
I like to continue from in that vein because I like this question because I think about equity. There's that we talk about this as academics in these sort of abstract terms, but a lot of equity is really about what can we do to change the material conditions of people's lives, and can we give them a way of making a living. So in our work with veterans, most veterans come from backgrounds of poverty. We don't have the draft anymore, but we have a thing that we call draft by poverty, because so many people who enlist, it's not a love of their country or honor. They do it because they want to afford college, or they don't have any other thing to do where they can survive or provide for their families. And so we have an entirely veteran-led program. So every single person who delivers our program is veterans. Almost all of them are very, very low income veterans of color, mostly self-identified Black veterans. We find that they come from backgrounds where they were that kid in the class, in the English class, sitting back there saying, well, what do you mean I got to read Shakespeare? For them to reclaim Shakespeare and make it their own and perform it in ways that an invited audience would say, I've never understood Shakespeare until you did it. That's a way of achieving equity, because not only do we pay every veteran who walks across that stage, but we also make sure that we teach them to use the skills of the classical actor training on job interviews, how to keep a job. They have Shakespeare's breathing techniques in their back pocket. So they go into jobs knowing, oh, you're a veteran, you might snap at any minute and become violent or angry. They call upon the grounding and breathing. They recognize, we don't use the term trigger, obviously, with veterans, but they know that when there's an activator there, they calm, they breathe. They interview at job interviews by grounding their feet, looking the person in the eye, taking a breath, and speaking their story. If someone says, oh, I see in your resume, you're a veteran, they don't look down, shuffle their feet and say, yeah, I served, because they know the stereotype. Oh, you're probably violent. They look the person in the eye saying, yes, I'm a veteran. I learned teamwork. I learned leadership. I learned a lot of things. And that's because I'm a veteran. That's a way of using the ability to pay and change people's material conditions to reduce inequities, I think.
I'm going to chime in here because I love what you both said. And what you're talking about is some of the work that IndigiDreams is doing with our Indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island. And it's really about this going beyond survival. It's about how we term in our native work that we do, survivance, which is an Anishinaabe word that Gerald Visner, many decades ago. But we're at a place of survivance where we are taking our self-expression in these mediums and these tools to really begin to come to not just this place of survival, but to these places and spaces of enormous creativity in synthesis and renewal. Because equity at the core is about coming back to wholeness, making us well and whole again. And where does that begin? It begins with ourself, with our breath, with the vibration of that breath, with the body that we're speaking from, that we're seeing, that we're editing, that we're communicating from. And Matthew, like you said, there's something there in that vibration. And when when we record and work with our Indigenous peoples, and when they use their first language, their native language, there's a level of resonance where you can feel, you can hear the ancestors coming through. And so I think when we get them to that place of that survivance, there's enormous, we haven't even begun to reach the places that we can with storytelling. If we could take the power and beauty of that and really use that in the world today. And I kind of began seeing that happening with the pandemic. Something good came out of that. Look at the conversation we're having now on this tool and how people are beginning to create their stories, in the social media realm, these clips of how they're feeling, how they're thinking, how they're being in this world with everything happening. So I love where all of you are going and what we're doing together.
I'll just add quickly that I've really struggled with this question. I've had people in other spaces ask, well, how is your spoken project? How are you making these videos addressing the structure or system of racial oppression? And it's a tough answer for me, because I don't know that I feel confident saying that what I'm doing right now is addressing that structure. I think there's a way to do it. I don't know that I'm creative enough to figure it out. And that's why these spaces are so amazing. And I mean, I feel like part of my own story is that I'm learning about the power of storytelling. And right now, the last several minutes has really helped me think about equity in a way maybe that's broader and more, the returning someone to whole as a form of equity is beautiful imagery. And in my field, we talk about, which is such an individual specific field, psychology, we're usually only thinking about the individual. And when I think about equity, I think about systems. And how does a field dedicated to individuals really address structures? That's the struggle I'm figuring out, but I really am inspired and I'm a little more heartened to hear about this idea of that returning someone to whole is part of the equity. And, in a just world, we wouldn't have to experience oppression based on race, gender, sexual orientation. And if we can bring some healing to people, an individual healing moment, that is maybe part of the equity picture. I just want to say hi to some of my friends I'm seeing in the comments. Larissa, Jill, good to see the people who should be on this panel are attending.
I love that. I'm just,
If I
yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to do one caveat. It's not returning them to wholeness, because we don't do that. It's them themselves taking the tools and going on that journey to that, like you said, by going back through the photos, listening to their voice, going on this pathway for themselves. When you ask the basic questions about, who they are, where they come from, and where they're going, what they've done, whether you're a veteran or a domestic violence survivor. And so in that pathway, if you just do some genuine listening, and then they recount the memories, and you create a place of truth telling and honesty, where we're all, in Navajo, we call it balashklai. We're all five-fingered people. So we have that capacity to go to these places because we've felt that grief, that shame, that sadness. And when we go to those places together, they help us as well as we're helping them, because we're all on this path together as human beings. And the institutions were made by a thought, by a human being. So let's question that by saying, how did that happen? And how do we get back to that wholeness, not just as individuals or communities, but as nation states? Thank you for letting me jump in there.
No, please. That's what this is all about, is having a conversation. And I think that was very beautifully said. It just makes me think about how connected storytelling is, but also the importance of, this is deeply personal work. And I think there's been this history of trying to separate people from story and like what we can do with that. And I do think that in this process, when we're thinking about like the process itself, not just outcomes, maybe as important as they are, I think we have this tendency in this overproductive capitalistic world to kind of focus on that. But I think storytelling and story making and story sharing has this inherent beauty in the process, and leads me very nicely to my next question. And maybe we can continue to delve a little deeper into this point, which is, how does the storytelling process impact the well-being of the people involved? And so thinking about the storytellers themselves, but the families, the communities, maybe the interviewers, if that's the modality that's being used. I'll open it up again. I don't know, Dr. Manuelita, if you want to continue or if someone else wants to jump in on that thread.
What Brenda was saying about recounting memories, that's really the heart of how we do this work of healing with veterans. We report all these quantitative data on PTSD, depression, et cetera, because it's the only way that we can get federal grants to pay the veterans who deliver our programs. This country is not really fond of funding the arts or supporting veterans in the ways that they truly need. They're good at medicating and pathologizing veterans, not at supporting veteran communities. What we do is when they have a verse of Shakespeare that they connect to and they recite it and they feel it in their bodies. And at that moment is where we say, when have you felt like that before? It's like, yeah, when I was with my buddies and we were scared and I felt that fear and I felt like I don't belong here because I don't believe in what they're telling me to do. I don't belong. And then we ask, when's the first time you felt like that? And it's like, I'm a little kid, I'm in my room, I'm scared, something bad is happening. I never talked about this, but when I felt like that, when I was in Afghanistan, I first felt like that then when I was 4. And so veterans come to the program thinking they're going to write about combat trauma. By the time they finish the program, the majority of them end up speaking about adverse childhood events as their trauma, which is actually shown in the data on veterans, which is that usually that decision that precipitates their decision to join is something traumatic going back to childhood. And we know that veterans have, an overrepresentation of that sort of trauma. So that healing goes beyond what you see when you look at the pre-post data on PTSD and depression. We also find the healing in community members because when they do that final culminating session, they share their stories. We have hundreds of women who've gone through Decruit. I don't think I've met one yet who didn't experience military sexual trauma. Very few have told their family members. So that's how they learn about what happened to their daughter or their wife, etc. And they know the conventions of theater, which is you sit there, you make space, you bear witness to their trauma, and you don't interrupt and say, why did you go back there? You were raped twice by your commanding officer. Why'd you go back for another tour if that was going to happen? You just listen to her. And the fellow veterans, male veterans maybe knew that this was going on in their unit and they looked the other way. They're all bearing witness too. That's the power of theater, because we listen to each other, and that heals the veteran who's sharing their story and the fellow community members as well. So it actually has that ripple effect through the community.
Thank you, Alicia. I just want to come to one of because there's a lot of things that you're doing with the veterans that are also happening. And I think one of the core things, like you said, is it's set upon Indigenous protocols and healing modalities. And so, the indigenized way that we do digital storytelling is really a kind of liberating, self-expressive healing journey. It's ceremony. It's ceremony in the way that we're unraveling not just all our wounds, but all the wonders of our human spirit. And I, as a Dene woman, want to take that even further, because the question says, how are we healing the individuals we work with in the communities? But we're also healing the land that this violence occurred on, where violence happens to us, the physical bodies, our bones, our wounds, our memories, and the land remembers as well. So for Indigenous peoples, during colonization, it was a kind of kinesthetic violence that happened for many of our ancestors. And so we believe with IndigiDreams, it's going to be a kinesthetic healing through the body that we're going to be affecting that. But that when these happen, like I'm in Lakota Ray because we're doing an IndigiFest, it's like birthing these stories and carrying them into the community to honor and celebrate these stories of that act of survivance that people are, that they're actively present, that we're still here. And what that does is it's rippling out into the land and into the water, into the trees, where generations ago, their family, their ancestors had experienced that physical violence. That is being healed as well. And so I urge us to think much broader and bigger in some of these discussions. And that's why this work is so important, in that the way that it's going deep and going wide, and why it's needed now today.
That's reminding me about just the idea that predominantly white institutions can often be sites of racial injury and violence towards students of color, whether knowingly or unknowingly. The monuments that we continue to keep up, the names that we keep on buildings, the historical traumas that have taken place within many of them that are represented in the Southeast for sure. When I think about the ways that we intend for our interventions to impact a number of myriad of people involved as audiences, it's not as intimate as I'm hearing with the work that Dr. Alicia does with veterans. I want to know more about that, but I'm just thinking about some of the attendees that would have come to our From Color to Black theatrical intervention, and the way that we in some ways conceptualize what the intention was for them, which for Black attendees was certainly to provide some sort of examples that would help them to contextualize and process, the relationship that they have between their ancestral suffering and the weight of history's impact on their lives today, while also continuing to push the boundaries and provoke Black people to think about wellness outside of those kind of historical boundaries, and think through some approaches to radical wellness. I'm sure for our white attendees, we were intending to challenge them to really interrogate their ancestral connections to pain inflicted upon Black people that they may or may not know about, or the ways in which they live that continues that legacy of negative impacts on Black wellness. And then I guess in some ways thinking through people of color that are not Black, wanting to create or illuminate a history of overlapping marginalization, and presenting it in a way where they understand the ways that they may or may not be complicit in perpetuating that oppression in a way that continues to compromise Black wellness. And so those are the ways that we hope the theatrical intervention that I mentioned, is having some sort of lasting impact on our audiences.
I mean, wow, the work that you are doing in your communities is really inspiring, all of you. And again, I'm operating at a much smaller scale. I think what I could speak to is the own transformation that I've experienced. So in my spoken project, I'm the video production person. I film, I edit, I'll do an interview. We'll do interviews with a person, maybe 2 hours of interview. And so then I will take that footage and I will sit in front of my computer for a weekend. I mean, my partner can tell you, I will listen to a 2-hour interview several times. And what I realized after the first few times doing this, like what I'm experiencing personally is healing that I didn't know I needed. I'm experiencing meaning. I'm finding meaning. I'm finding hope. And so for me, it really has been a transformation from thinking about the outcome of the storytelling work to the process. And that I feel like I've benefited the most from the work that I've done, which sounds a little gross to say, but I think it speaks to the reality of the connection, and that connection really does something. And so I'm trying to take that and think about how can I create storytelling experiences for others who can have a similar experience that I'm having. And so for me, the positive outcomes are not only just learning how to cope with racism, but finding hope in the face of ongoing racism. For me, I think I've needed this, because without this work that I'm doing the last 3 years, the last 48 years of my life, there's not a lot of hope when it comes to thinking about when is racism going to be done? When will people not be treated poorly or killed because of their skin? There's not a lot of hope in there, but in hearing these stories and connecting with them at many levels, for me, has provided a sense of healing and hope that I couldn't have imagined, that I'm not deserving of it, but that kind of inspires me to keep moving forward and trying to create these moments for other people.
Thank you. And if I may build on that, I really am hearing the importance of almost starting with ourselves, right? And starting with ourselves and doing that personal work to understand and unpack. And I know for me, I've had to unlearn so many things about, this land, about history, because we were taught false histories. That was done intentionally and on purpose. And so it really starts with the personal, and then thinking about that connection, because then how do we engage in solidarity? How do we think about Black communities, Indigenous communities, people of color? And there's this intentional hierarchy that's put in place, right? Of like, who's better than who, and what does that look like? So really I'm hearing that importance of starting with yourself and then going bigger, because we all need to heal ourselves as well. I also, in the chat, I've been following a little bit, and I think people are really resonating with what all of you are saying. And we have a couple of questions coming in, so I do want to make some time for that. One of the questions overlaps really nicely with our final question, which is, we've talked about all of this work, but when we're looking forward to the future, and specifically a more equitable and just future, I wonder what are the lessons that you can give us that we can take forward into research and policy. One of the things I'm also hearing is this, predominantly white institutions, and like, how are we navigating that? And one of the questions that's also come up is like, how do you deal with maybe some of those internal policies, or some of that pushback or red tape, and maybe some strategies or advice if we're brainstorming together, like how can we help each other out? And I'll open it up to anyone. It's a big question.
I can start with a small answer. I'll answer that last question first. I think one of the things is, if you are a radical academic, the best thing that you can do is do what you need to do to get tenure. And at that point, when you don't owe things to the people who granted you tenure, be as radical and audacious and as anti-racist and anti-oppressive as you can, and set a model for those who are coming behind you, because it's such a difficult game to play. I love what you said, Nada, about the unlearning in psychology, because we have this basis in what we do, which is positivistic, quantitative, and we've been beaten down by that. We use our work to sort of speak against that, almost beating the positivist, reductionistic researchers at their own game. So one of the advantages of having federal research grants is that we are allowed to have tools and technologies to do the same sorts of studies that the people who use a pathologizing biomedical model with veterans do. So we know, for instance, we look at depression a lot because it's so high in the veteran community. You go to medical conferences and they say we use this SSRI, these antidepressants. They put up pre-post brain scans to show, look at how effective it is. And they say, well, this proves that there is a serotonin deficiency that caused this person's depression. We know that's not true. The serotonin deficiency does not cause depression. And so what we do, and I've been studying treatments for trauma for over 25 years, 20 years as a professor at NYU, before that as a professor in the medical school at University of Toronto. And what we do is we do pre-post brain scans of our veterans. And in the feminist psychology community, which is my community, I get vilified for that. It's like, you're doing the same thing that the people who study for drug companies do. And say, yes, but when I go to a medical conference and I put up a pre-post brain scan and everyone wants to know what drug did they take, and I say it's not really about a serotonin deficiency because our entire treatment was Shakespeare. So what did they have coming to the study? A sonnet deficiency? Like, how do you use your reductionistic models to explain something when we have data that parallel that you now cannot explain away? So I think that we need to subvert how science works by having scientists who know the truth and get to the point where they're able to speak the truth without fear of being oppressed by the white institutions that deliberately try to keep us from having a voice.
Very powerful. Thank you. So I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, okay, am I a radical academic or maybe like Matthew, a recovering academic? Because out of all the panel, I left academia because this work was so important to do outside of the boundaries of an academic institution. Because when we've co-created over 1,500 digital stories across 92 Native nations. And so in the Pacific Northwest, I was at a research institution, the second one doing this work. And there was discussions about intellectual property. And I said, the stories belong to the people who make them. And that's a place of respect, and they don't belong to the university or to IndigiDreams, belongs to the people. And that power, that agency to decide what goes in it, how it's going to be edited, how it's going to be felt, how it's going to be distributed, belongs to the people. And so during the Great Recession, that was the time where I felt we needed to move this into the grassroots and build it from there. And so like you, Alicia, it's about, taking our PhDs and using them to find those subversive ways to go in, to do the work that needs to happen, wherever we're at, because we need to move beyond these medicalized ways, these structures that have been formed. I used to talk about, it's time we stop talking about health disparities, and then finally there's a new word that comes around and we just kind of go into the spiral, and that's why it does exist historical trauma, but there's also this historical greatness that we really need. And that's kind of what catapulted, because I was tired about hearing about all the Native people who had alcoholism or diabetes or cancer. There was reasons for that. And the body, if one of the great places we're talking about the research and policy, I think what we're talking about is this new era of somatic healing. It's a new term, but it's an old method that we use with Native communities. It's about how things get stuck in the body. And the medical community will call it, tumors or things, but it's energy, it's congealed energy. And in a lot of our indigenous ways of our people, many of our people around the world, we're able to move that energy through movement, through the body, through voice, through sound, through ceremony, through dance. And so I think that we really need to bring those kinds of modalities together with science to really look at it much broader. And I really applaud all the work that you're doing. And like I said, I still don't know if I'm radical or recovering or what, but I love the work that I'm doing and that you're all doing. So keep it up.
I know that we have a few more questions as well, and maybe we can tie that back in. Dr. Yewande and Dr. Matt, if you want to speak to this, one of the questions that came up was, first of all, we're talking about this concept of radical academic. And I think like someone actually had a question for you, Dr. Addy, that if you could elaborate on what you mean by radical wellness and how that plays into this.
Okay. Well, I'm by no means an expert on radical wellness, but I'll do my best. I guess in some ways, pushing away from conventional methods of wellness and leaning into a more extremely grounded spiritual, emotional journey towards balance in wellness, meaning in mind, body, and spirit. And that can look very different for different people depending on the types of metaphorical or physical injuries that they experience. It may be going out into the work world with natural hair as a Black woman. It may be showing up and experiencing microaggressions because people cannot pronounce your name. It may be committing to yourself in a way that you show up in the world that gives you the sense of confidence and empowerment that you need in order to survive. And so it's kind of hard to put a clear-cut definition for me on radical wellness, because I know that that's going to look very different for everyone depending on what kind of wellness level they're at already. But I hope that kind of adds some sense of clarity to what I mean by stepping outside of that biomedical conventional understanding of what illness is and looking within for a curative approach to your own wellness.
Yeah,
Just one other thought I wanted to say about the radical versus recovering. And in many ways, I've been in academia for like 16 years, and I feel like as someone who's interested in addressing social issues and oppression, like academia has left me. Not that I'm, the degree to which academia continues to prioritize top tier publications and grants as the most important mark. That's just, I think in the storytelling framework, that's really meaningless. That's not how we're going to achieve equity and healing. I think watching historian Twitter over the last few years versus social science Twitter, it shows how out of touch and irrelevant social science and psychology is on the cusp of being completely irrelevant in addressing racism and other social issues. You can see this on social media. Like, yes, there's great studies published. Watch the historians on Twitter and how they contextualize, and their storytelling is eye-opening. And the degree to which social scientists or psychologists like myself are unable to tell a compelling story to policymakers, doesn't matter how good my research is. If I cannot communicate that in a compelling way to someone who's actually making policy, I might as well just be, speaking to myself. And that's the lesson I'm trying to learn, which is how can I take all of the knowledge that people in my field are generating, but communicate it in a way that's compelling to policymakers, that is going to move the dial a little bit to make them disrupt an oppressive policy. If the only skill I have is to tell them about why a chi-square value is important or an effect size is important, that level of argumentation is just, that is not what is going to work in 2022 and beyond. And for all of you out there who are in a similar discipline, we have to evolve. We're going to do the research, but we have to communicate it in a way that is compelling and meaningful outside of the journal world. And if we don't, we really are becoming increasingly irrelevant. And I think at some point we'll just be gone. I think. Okay, mute me. I don't know if that's radical or out of touch, but.
No, thank you. I think that's given me so much to think about. I mean, as a PhD student, I came into this because I was like, I'm tired of looking at how people are doing harmful research. But like now I'm on this whole other journey of like, where do I go with this? And how do I do this in a meaningful, engaging, thoughtful way? And one of the questions we actually had come up is from a graduate student and junior scientist who's talking about how interested they are in connecting storytelling to their research, but struggling morally with exploiting cultural practices for scientific gain. And I think this is a really important point and a tension that comes up. So any tips or advice for making sure research is grounded in uplifting the community?
I think the number one way to achieve that is by engaging community in the research. They have to be at the center. They have to be able to weigh in on what matters outside of your own personal research agenda. And so often we get stuck in the rut of exploiting disparities when the people that are impacted the most should be the ones that have the opportunity to weigh in on how to reorganize that agenda and to have some sort of liberatory contribution to that effort.
I think we need to change the way that IRB functions within universities, and we need to say it's unethical to do research on people when you're not involving them and actively including them. And so the whole ethical review process for approving projects needs to be changed. And also just simply giving credit. I mean, we've never published or presented at a conference that we didn't have at least one of the veterans involved as a co-author, as a co-presenter. I mean, if I was allowed to put them as PIs on grants, I would. Until the world changes, we do what we can to subvert a broken and damaging system.
Thank you all so much. This conversation just flew by. We're almost at time, and I just want to open up the floor for any just last thoughts before I close us up. I know that there are so many things we could continue to chat about, but just maybe a quick 30-second closing thought from all of you.
My closing thought is again that this is such a precious time because of where we're at. Matt, you had mentioned about Twitter, and I was reading a report that like 15 billion views of story bites are coming out there. And now, we have Indigenous grandmothers who are on Zoom, doing story circles and talking circles. And so there's a way that with this technology, which has often been used in destructive ways, but there's an important way we can capture this technology. And, I had mentioned in one of our planning meetings that from our Indigenous way of doing the work that Carmela Rodriguez and I do with IndigiDreams, if you look at it, and even quantum science talks about this, is everything is alive. There's energy in that. There's a crystal healing silica sand. These are all earth elements. And we're all those human beings trying to be better human beings on this earth. And it's through those story bites and using them in ways we haven't even imagined, to help to do that healing. And what's happening, it's almost like we're doing important work, but they're almost in silos still. So I'm really excited to find a way to continue this conversation with the rest of the panelists, because it's this kind of conversation, the diversity of it, the ways we're working, where we're all doing this such important work, but how can we do it together in meaningful ways to connect those dots? So thank you for for everything that you've shared.
And I think the connections between the communities, I mean, the system is so good at sort of like putting one marginalized community and pitting them against another because there's so few resources, and it's an intentional divide and conquer. So people say, how can you be a feminist psychologist? You're studying veterans. It's like, where do you see toxic masculinity play out more than in the military? We need to understand it to dismantle it. When we look at the way that we use, Brenda talked about ceremony. We have ritualized practice in Decroot because they come from a system where they had a routine every day. They took comfort in that in military life. Now they're untethered from that and without the support of their comrades. So we begin and end every session with everyone in a circle, and we call it reinforcements because we use military terminology. It's familiar, but you reinforce something. Like you say, today I would say, I reinforced what I learned today from every person in this space to me. And then you tap the person beside you and they go around in a circle. It's based on Indigenous practice. We have to understand that our communities, our humanity is more intimately connected than science will ever be able to say, unless science radically changes and we listen to people's stories and truly listen to each other, which I think, this panel today, such a beautiful example of that. Nada, you did a wonderful, fabulous job. You really did. So thank you, all of you. And thank you, Nada, as well for that.
I'm really appreciative of the space, the energy that everyone gave among the other panelists and Nada, our moderator, and everyone that's attended. I'm just going to continue hammering the idea that stories really do change the world. When I think about every damaging narrative that exists out there in the world, when I think about welfare queens or crack babies or any sort of negative stereotype that we could exploit is linked to some sort of anecdotal story that we keep telling over and over and over and over and over again, which means that there is a potential to dismantle that through storytelling. And so I'm just so full and empowered and excited to continue doing this work throughout my research with Project Refocus, and hopefully maybe some collaborations on the Zoom here. So thank you.
I just will quickly say, I was trained to think about interventions and outcomes, and I think it's about experiences, and storytelling provides experiences and moments, and the last hour has been that for us. And to think about, if you're still wondering about the storytelling thing and what it does, I mean, we've just shared an experience through a narrative and a story that we just developed, and I think it's been meaningful for me, and I encourage all of you to think about how you can incorporate it in your work.
Thank you all so much. I am so incredibly grateful that I got to be a part of this, and just to echo what everyone has said, and the energy and the comments coming through in the chat, just if none of our panelists have had a chance to see it, people are really appreciative and also echoing and feeling a lot of those sentiments and those tensions and frustrations. But also, I think there was #historical greatness, looking to the past, there's been this beautiful history that has often been rewritten in multiple ways. And how do we look to the future and really come together to understand what has happened in the past, but also how to dismantle some of those structures and systemic barriers and all the oppressions, racism, colonialism, etc. And how the process of story making, storytelling, story sharing needs to be community engaged. It needs to be with community, and not reproduce harms like many of you have described today, and influence policy and practice. But also importantly, research and policy needs to listen to all these varied and rich stories and voices. So I just want to thank everyone so much for your time and your energy today, the panelists, everyone behind the scenes at Global Alliance, but also if you joined today live or if you're watching the recording, thank you so much. And this is just one part of many more conversations that I think we all need to have and engage in and learn and support each other. I do want to encourage everyone. I know there was a question about everyone's work. So we do have links to everyone's work. They were put in the chat, but they'll also be up on the website as well. So please do check them out. They're an incredible wealth and depth of stories there that we can continue to share and continue to learn from. So thank you everyone so much, and have a beautiful rest of your day.